So my topic was on the globalization of big sports like the Olympics and the World Cup in developing countries. So globalization is a process of interaction and integration with the sharing of world views, products, ideas, and other aspects of culture. And in the past, the world economy was depressed, and when it started to recover, it was because of an increase of globalization. So this article was based in Brazil, and it talked about how the neoliberals theory says many markets from different countries come together as a single global market. And it's a benefit to have the internet and technology because everyone's able to get information and share information, exchange products, because it's like borderless. Um, and they argue that the World Cup and the Olympics are a great way to exchange technology and experience and ideas and create wealth because it's such a big event. Um, so the World Cup and the Olympics in Brazil was good because Brazil wanted to get on the map and prove it wasn't just a developing country. So Brazil held a great World Cup to prove to the world that a developing nation was capable of holding a large event and holding it successfully, which led Brazil to be very well known as far as its culture, and people started investing and showed its government. So then the international events got rid of the negative news about Brazil and helped its economic development because it helped rebuild software and hardware facilities, and it helped with the city renewal project, which was because foreign and local investors invested in the city and skyrocketed the income, which reduced the financial burden and also created jobs, which increased employment for all of these people without jobs. And but a lot of people that were living there weren't happy because they had to increase the public transportation tariffs, which caused riots because it didn't pay attention to the social development of the country and the rights of these people who are paying into these taxes. And the government was focusing mainly on improving the army and the police and the security for events with some of this money, but they weren't focusing on the people that were living there. So the homicide rate increased, and they didn't really do much about it because it wasn't time for the Olympics yet. And then, but on the other hand, some people did think it was beneficial to sports in general because all the sports were being televised, and it was everyone was able to see soccer and football and track, all these other things that some countries might not have. And then, so I picked articles that had either really negative opinions on the globalization of sport or really positive opinions, and they were very much apart because there's not really, you can't really be both, I guess, is what I got from these articles. So the negatives were, one of the main ones was it widened the gap between the rich and the poor, mainly because the poor became poorer because they lowered the standard of living because they were forced into bad apartments, bad areas, and it increased the dependence on outsourcing for materials, so they weren't using the local businesses, which was not helping people that had these local businesses make any money. And then, which there was also a labor issue for the sportswear makers. So they had terrible work conditions to begin with, and they just got worse as they had to make thousands and thousands of T-shirts. And they had already had low wages and long hours. And because of this event, their job security was very low because when the event was done, so were they. They had no need to make thousands of T-shirts, so they didn't need thousands of employees, which hurt these workers because they were trying to make money for their families to live and their job could be over just like that. But they also never got rewarded because none of them could afford to go to the Olympics. So they could never see the event they were making all these shirts for. And then the transnational corporation that hires them, they have seen profit and they have been involved in multi-million-dollar deals, but they haven't spent a dollar on increasing the pay for these people. They haven't spent a dollar on the conditions. And it's because people like us, like Americans, refuse to pay a lot of money for shirts. We want everything as cheap as we can get it. We don't want to pay $25 for a t-shirt. We want to pay $15, which is reducing the amount of money they can give to these employees. So is it like really benefiting them to work? Like, I don't know. And then another problem is there's a issue with the migration of athletes to different countries. So the free trade of athletes is favorable for the athletes and the coaches because they're promised benefits and pensions. But for example, like when the Kenyans got moved to the Persian Gulf nations to play, there was a decreased talent left in Kenya, which was less money for them to be able to make for their actual country that they have grown up in, and less opportunity for like for Kenya to be involved in these sports because they didn't have as much talent anymore. And it also allowed citizenship to an athlete very quickly, versus someone who's been trying to get into this country for years and years. They've taken the test. These athletes just say they're good at a sport, prove it, and these countries want them, so they expedite. Like, for example, one of the countries you had to be in the military for 2 years. They didn't have to do that. They just needed to be good at a sport. And then it's also a problem with the pay of the mixed teams because a player from the Dominican Republic would make maybe $2,000 as a signing bonus, and then an American could make $1.2 million in a bonus, and it's just because Americans know they should be making that money according to like the normal signing bonus around here. And the Dominican Republic is like, wow, $2,000 is like a good amount. And it's also like a positive that the media is able to capture everything, but the media's ownership of sports properties can lead to only sports that can be commercialized thriving because they're not promoting these sports that won't be like bought by the media. And another problem is the environment. So the cost is paid by the city for energy and resources that are used by athletes during these big events, which is a lot of energy and a lot of resources. And it's using the public's money. So like they're not happy about that because they've been paying these taxes, they've been giving money. Why should it be used on an athlete that is going to be there for 2 weeks and they don't see any of the benefits? And they also, the like Olympic board doesn't care about the country's wishes. For example, in the Olympics, the officials wanted a ski course to be longer, like 130 meters. But by doing this, they would be ruining an ecologically sensitive area of the mountain. But if this country wouldn't ruin their mountain, then they weren't going to have the Olympics there, which, can you really say like ruining a mountain is worth like holding an Olympics? Like that mountain's never going to be the same. And it's the same with like golf courses. And in Brazil, they use a lot of their land for agriculture, and they have like a no deforestation policy. And they had to build a golf course, and it like ruined some of the natural habitat of Brazil. And now their only use for it is an airport because they had all this flat land that they couldn't grow anything on because it was killed. And another problem with the neighborhoods was that low-income neighborhoods were cleared in order to make way for the renovation for Olympics, which left people displaced because of the high rent inflation, like I said, and they had nowhere to go. Like, all of their family lived there, and they were all ended up on the street, and they had no public money to help them get a house because it was all being used for the Olympic Village dream world that needed to be seen on TV. And then another example the um, of Brazil was they had to knock down a hill to hold their Olympics because they needed extra space, and now it's just like a pile of rubbish. And then some of the positives were that the pressure from the transnational corporation pushed for globalization in places where there was able to be international capital and government, with markets and trade regulations that were increasing in relations. And then the communication of the technology has already been improved, which is really big because you can communicate with people all around the world and see like what ideas are working, what aren't. And there's actually already more globalization for sports. In the UN, there's 192 members, and then like in the Olympics, there's 203. So that's already more than the United Nations. And then sports also lead to a diversity in an athlete's origin, which actually helps poorer countries receive attention, because you say like, oh, like who is this guy, and you find out he's from this country, and all of a sudden that country, you're like Googling it, you're figuring out like different things about this country that you would have never thought about if you would have never seen this guy because you wouldn't have known about this country. It's also increased the number of competing international games, which allows more athletes to participate in more diverse sports. It sometimes helps cross gender borders, religious borders, climate borders. Like you can ski in a hot climate because they might make like a snow bubble. And it's interesting to see like how many more opportunities these people have because of the globalization of sports. And it also adds more jobs for coaches and athletes. So it does provide more permanent jobs for these people. And there was also a case where it forced countries to stop their differences because they had to be in that country, like they had to stop their differences so they could play the Olympics, which ended up helping actually. And it also helped for diversity in teams because if you know the rules of the game, you can play with anyone. So it helped with like communication. If they couldn't speak the same language, they could still play the game because they knew they knew the rules, what was going to happen. And another thing I thought was interesting was it allowed countries with like a bitter history of like racism and oppression display like a brighter future for their young because they were able to have this awesome event, like with like beautiful things that came out of it. Like they had this awesome building left behind, so it was like just like a brighter future for the youth to look forward to. And then the lure of these large events was a great way to attract media interest in the host city, which would increase the capitalism and tourism and investments, and then the tourism would bring money, which would help their economy. The only thing that made them nervous was when this event was over, after they spent millions of dollars building this Olympic city, would they still have tourists after to like bring their money back? And that was the only problem with it. And it also brought different countries to see this developing country in a good way, and also to like learn their culture. So in South America, they they had hosted several big events, and they chose to have a song about migrant workers who died at a young age. It was like a pretty sad song, but then they showed how now they're stronger, more united. They're developing more. They're not dying at as young of age. They have better jobs. So it was like cool to see how these events have helped them grow as a nation. And then, so I just thought, seeing the different sides, like there are negatives, like they are wasting public money on these buildings. They are making the poor poorer and live in bad environments, but they also are bringing good attention to these countries, which is allowing for more investments, and then which could eventually lead to them becoming a developed nation. And then, so my first question is, do you think countries should stop using public funds that are supposed to be used for public issues and move it to paying for the renovations for the Olympic Village and the arena? And why or why not? So basically, like, do you think it's fair to these residents of this country to spend the money that they've been paying in taxes just to make something better for the Olympics that's going to be there for a week? My second question was, do you think it's okay for a panel of people to force a country to ruin its existing buildings and landscapes to make it more extravagant building and have better courses, which my example was using the mountain, like having to tear it down that hill too. Is that okay just to build a course that's going to be longer? And my other question was, can we as Americans make a difference in labor if we agree to pay a few extra dollars for a shirt to increase a laborer's pay? Like, do you think people would be willing to pay $25 versus $15 for a shirt if they knew the people making their shirts were going to make more than a couple dollars an hour and actually be able to, like, live a life? And then I also was thinking, like, do you think it's okay for people to be able to skip the whole process of becoming a citizen and allowing athletes to bypass that whole thing just to play a sport for their country? Like, I know the sport person will make a lot of money for them and bring a lot of attention, but how is it fair to the people who have been trying to get into this country for years just because they can't play a sport as well? So that's most of my questions. I just thought it was interesting that there could be so many good benefits to having globalization of sports, but how there could also be, like, bad side effects, which I actually didn't think there would be, but this led me to believe there could be both sides.